to their futures. Soldiers speak out.
Welcome to the Veterans Hour, a monthly program produced by the Rachel Corrie Chapter 109, Veterans for Peace in Olympia, Washington. I'm Mark Fleming, your host for this program. Veterans for Peace is a global organization of military veterans and allies whose collective efforts build a culture of peace. As veterans, we are a unique and important voice to inform public about the true causes and enormous costs of war and emphasize nations' obligations to heal the wounds of war. The Rachel Corrie chapter in Olympia is over 140 chapters worldwide, whose work includes educating the public, dismantling the war economy, assisting veterans and victims of war, eliminating nuclear weapons, and most significantly, working to end all war. One of the key issues facing the United States and the world these days is the danger of nuclear war. The Rachel Corrie chapter is a member of the Olympia Coalition to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which works to end the nuclear threat. This program presents a powerful history about the development of and thinking about nuclear weapons from beginning to end. My guest is Jim Manista, who created the video for use in the Coalition's 4-session course, Nuclear Weapons Nowadays, What You Can Know and Can Do. Jim is an active member of the Olympia Coalition. He's one of the 4 instructors for the course and has participated in nonviolent resistance against the nuclear-armed Trident submarines stationed at the U.S. Navy base near Bangor, Washington. So welcome, Jim. It's good to have you. So let's get started. So tell us a little bit about this video and how you came to produce it.
Well, the video deals with kind of my reaction to the history of development and use and proposed uses of nuclear weapons. Back in college in the mid-60s, I was confronted with the ethical problem of population bombing. Simply the matter that the British and Americans were bombing German cities, irrespective of whether they were hitting factories or targets like wharves and such. And likewise, the Germans had developed a similar process, attacking towns like Coventry, populated sections of London. And this was a case of one devil chasing another. If they were going to behave like barbarians, then so were we. And it slipped into the morals of war that this somehow was okay. After all, they started it. Let's give them hell. It's war. Previous to this, though, humanity had tried to restrict war and keep it from getting absolutely brutal. They came from a recollection that there will be a time after the war when we have to befriend these people for our own good. And so we should wage war in a more a gentlemanly manner. I mean, it got to the point where armies would go out on a field and people would come to watch with picnics and so forth. This took place during the Civil War. But with increasing mechanization and other things developing like hyper-nationalism, war became a factory process dependent upon the new industrial revolution.
And then in this video, you should kind of trace the science of basically how science led us to this, to nuclear weapons, our curiosity about the world and things around us. So tell a little bit about the framework you used.
I think people can understand the basic science of nuclear weapons. And it is not a terribly great mystery once you're familiar with some of the facts. In our early history, the only energy we dealt with was chemical energy until, of course, at the turn of the century, 1900, we were coming to realize that there was a totally new force. There was something that could be tremendously more energetic. For instance, if the sun had only been a burning piece of coal, the scientists of the period knew it would have burned out long before we get here. So there must be some other energy. And with radiation coming to the fore, being discovered in radium and uranium and plutonium, there were kinds of doors open to the new energy. And many were planning to open it up fully. With the scare of the war, though, the fact that this new energy could be used by Hitler moved many of the Allies to develop this as a preventive against Hitler's use of it.
So yeah, it's kind of interesting. Like our own innate curiosity led us to this place, and it also, as you say, produced a kind of power that is immense. And you also talked about the lack. We don't really have a framework or moral, ethical framework for dealing with this.
No, we went from Cain beating Abel to murder, and from various other sorts of barbarian disagreements. And when the Romans took over towns, once they had beaten the forces, well, they pillaged, raped, and of course, took all sorts of booty. But then as humankind began to develop greater and greater understanding of what they were doing with war and what was suffering, in other words, the world after the war, that there would be populations hurt and not ready to recover. Then they tried to civilize war. And it's been a mixed bag ever since, that many feeling the torment of war that's inflicted on the enemy, and many saying, hey, it's war, anything goes.
Yeah, and this video is an integral part of the first session of our four-part course on nuclear weapons. And we encourage people to sign up for it. You can do that. I will provide the information at the end of the program on how you can enroll. So at this point, I would like to go ahead and start the video. You call it from beginning to end, from where we started to how we got here. So let's go ahead and watch the video.
Ladies and gentlemen, the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Like cancer, don't mention it and it will go away. I was 2 when Trinity christened us the atomic generation. We ducked and covered to get to be teenagers and later prayed to survive Cuba. This is my view of that history. I'll jump around a lot. How the bomb came to be, why we used it, why we fear it, and how we almost forgot it. When we first appeared on the earth, we found stuff and forces. The ancients thought earth, water, air, and fire were the 4 basic stuffs from which everything else was made. As for forces, we got hit with a pie, struck by lightning, or fell off a cliff. Curiosity got the better of us. What's inside? What makes it work? Let's take it apart. Doing what they could, they broke stuff open, dissolved it, or heated it. These ancient and medieval searchers, called alchemists, were steeped in magic and religion. Their dream, mixed with greed and lust, was to find the philosopher's stone, which, according to legend, could let them turn lead into gold and concoct a medicine to restore life and youth and to heal all illness, disease, and injury. Their methods, laced with sorcery and magic, were primitive and driven by appearances. Hennig Brand, as late as 1669, tried to make gold by boiling urine. He ended up with few friends and a white powder at the bottom of his flask. He had nonetheless discovered the 13th element, phosphorus. The chart above shows their results to 1828. With so many wizards, why were so few elements discovered? They didn't share their findings. No self-respecting wizard would give away his trade secrets. With the Enlightenment, potions and elixirs were out. Openness and scientific rigors were in. A French count, Antoine Lavoisier, wrote Elements of Chemistry in 1787, compiled the first list of elements, and helped revise and standardize procedures and records. As a French tax collector for the king, he was regrettably on the wrong side of the French Revolution and was summarily guillotined by illiterate peasants. Now, with standard practices, keeping accurate records and sharing results, chemists increased the list of known elements to 85 by 1900. It was obvious to many that some elements had similar properties. Russian chemist Dmitry Mendeleev in 1869 grouped them into a table by weight and the periodically recurring properties. Mendeleev predicted the gaps in the tables were for elements yet to be found. Research about forces found new ways to break stuff. In America, Ben Franklin showed lightning and static sparks were the same force. In London, Michael Faraday used currents from the new batteries to demonstrate how both how flowing electricity moved magnets and how magnets in motion generated electricity. Another English experimenter, William Crookes, used high-voltage electricity in evacuated tubes and produced light in various gases. The high-voltage currents, which were applied to a gas in a Crookes tube, produced rays. Those rays, which bent in one direction under a magnetic field, bent in the opposite direction under a reversed polarity, indicating things smaller than atoms might exist. Many elements burned. Many, compounded with others, exploded and were quickly put to military use. Swedish chemist and entrepreneur Alfred Nobel developed a stable form of nitroglycerin. Despite his reputation as a pacifist, he was successful only in making arms, smokeless powder for rifles, and finally dynamite. Known popularly as the Merchant of Death, Nobel thought the world would forsake war because of dynamite's extreme power. One chemist, Frenchman Henri Becquerel, working with heavier elements, observed uranium salts he had stored in a lab drawer, apparently exposed photographic plates he had placed in the same drawer. Between them was a Maltese cross medallion, the image of which had been burned onto the plates. Obviously, the uranium was giving off some form of invisible light. The discoverer of radium, Marie Curie, shown here with her husband Pierre, shared the Nobel Prize with Becquerel in 1903 for discovery of radioactivity. The new substance became quickly popular for its ability to make things fluoresce an eerily green glow. As a novelty, it was added to toothpaste, cure-alls, and most especially for hands and numbers, which could be seen in the dark, painted on watches and clocks. Women painters who drew the filaments of their brushes to a fine point with their lips frequently died of facial cancers. Radium caused anemia, cancer, cataracts, and death, as it was proven to be 3 million times more radioactive than uranium. Ironically, radium is prominently used today in fighting cancer. While Albert Einstein didn't perform experiments, he used theory and mathematics to reconcile and explain the results of others' discoveries. From the Michelson-Morley experiments, which showed the speed of light is constant in any direction, he concluded in 1905 that energy was equivalent to mass times a huge coefficient. Many later observations proved Einstein right. Finally, there was an answer to how the sun could produce so much light for so long, since no form of chemical energy was sufficient. The world was on a path to develop this new, magnificent energy. With the coming of the Great War, everything was placed on hold except for development of new methods of mass slaughter. Machine guns and poison gas replaced less lethal weapons. New giant airplanes and zeppelins dropped explosive and incendiary bombs directly on wharves and workers' housing along the Thames. The machine gun was once thought so horrible, like dynamite. If used, it would end the war itself. Although scientists knew atoms were too small to be seen, they speculated nonetheless on visible concepts. Democritus offered no image except to say they could not be cut any smaller. Dalton compared them to billiard balls, all the same size and shape, but differing in weight and properties. Thomson thought to stuff his newly discovered electrons inside his plum-pudding atoms. Rutherford showed atoms were mostly empty space, with a nucleus as a heavy center around which electrons circled like planets in a solar system. Bohr applied the rules of the developing quantum mechanics and produced the model shown in the next illustration. Bohr's model satisfied the needs of both physicists and chemists. The chemical energy of compounds, for example, CO2, H2O, NaCl, was explained by the making or breaking of bonds among electrons. By that thinking, the energy of chemical compounds, like dynamite, however spectacular in their own right, was minuscule compared to the energy available from Einstein's formula. Truly, that energy was something radically different from all other sources on Earth. Picasso's famous painting of the period, Guernica, captured in graphic imagery the horror of Nazi bombing of that Spanish town. The scenes recall the terrors and fires of London, bombed by Zeppelins and Gothas in the last great conflict. The howls of people and animals, and the monstrous separation of their limbs and bodies, fed the fears of all Europe, anticipating the next international war. In Germany, during the Christmas break of 1938, Lise Meitner, a young German physicist, and her colleague, Otto Frisch, concluded earlier colleagues must have split an atom. Meitner and Frisch explained they had sent a slowly moving neutron into a nucleus of uranium-235, which first transformed to its radioactive isotope, U-236, which then split into two nuclei, barium and krypton, releasing energy and free neutrons. Like others before her, namely Leo Szilard, she conceived if enough nuclei split, the consequent chain reaction in the U-235 would release catastrophically massive energy. This letter, very poorly shown, was drafted August 2, 1939 by Leo Szilard, a Hungarian-born physicist who fled the fascists in Mussolini's Italy, for Albert Einstein to sign and send to President Roosevelt. In it, he told FDR about the new scientific discoveries which could produce a weapon of enormous destructive force. As Germans led the world in physics, he advised FDR to begin research immediately, lest Hitler's scientists build it first and threaten America with it. World War II began just 29 days after the Einstein letter reached Roosevelt. Many Americans were isolationists, suspicious of foreign entanglements, and resisted directly entering the conflict until Japan bombed Pearl Harbor 2 years later. That same day, FDR, hoping the countries involved would respect moral principles of the time, wrote a letter to the heads of Germany, France, and England. In it he stated, "Armed forces shall in no event and under no circumstances undertake the bombardment from the air of civilian populations or of unfortified cities." Many feared the Germans were way ahead of the British and Americans on work toward an atomic weapon. But post-war release of documents revealed the Nazi efforts were poorly subsidized and headed down a blind alley. 2 images above show the state of Nazi atomic studies. Cubes of uranium strung together to be lowered into a pool of heavy water, which would slow the neutrons sufficiently to permit a controllable chain reaction. Except it didn't and wouldn't. Danish physicist Niels Bohr met with Werner Heisenberg, the counterpart heading up the Nazi atomic program, at a German conference on September 17, 1941. Heisenberg hoped to elicit from Bohr information about Allied progress when he treasonously delivered Bohr a quick sketch of a Nazi diagram. When Bohr showed the sketch at Los Alamos in 1943, scientists there clarified as a reactor, not a bomb. Enrico Fermi, working in secret below the University of Chicago's football stadium, used bricks of graphite to produce the world's first nuclear reactor. Its size, judged from the man, is why Einstein's 1939 letter cautioned FDR about a bomb which could be carried on a ship to destroy a harbor and a city. But British scientists had discovered as early as 1940 they could make a bomb small enough to be dropped by a conventional bomber. They quickly undertook an effort, but ultimately joined the Manhattan Project and shared their data. Also in December 1940, scientists at Berkeley, under the direction of Glenn T. Seaborg, used a cyclotron to produce plutonium 5 times more fissionable than uranium. Making the bomb required refining uranium and plutonium to extract and concentrate the elements to explosive potential. The Manhattan Project, headquartered in New York, quickly grew to a huge, secret, multi-site, expensive behemoth, involving over 130,000 people, few of whom knew the purpose of the project. It cost nearly $2 billion, about $23 billion today. Most was for building factories to produce and shape fissile material, and less than 10% for development. Research and development took place at more than 30 sites across the US, the UK, and Canada. German bombing at first was in support of advancing troops in Poland, the Low Countries, and France. In their attacks on England, however, no troops had yet invaded. In the Battle of Britain, where Hitler attempted to win air superiority, English fighters successfully resisted waves of German daytime raids. Goring then turned to massive nighttime bombing of English cities, known as the Blitz. As a result, English Bomber Command announced they would no longer spare enemy populations and began nighttime bomber attacks for the balance of the war. Reconnaissance flights after daylight strategic raids revealed few bombs hit anywhere near their targets. When losses of airplanes and crews grew too large to continue sustainably, as over Schweinfurt's ball-bearing complexes, American military chiefs decided to join in area bombing over Europe. This new approach resulted in a devastating firebombing of Dresden, among other German cities. The Norden bomb sight, with which a bombardier could reputedly drop a pickle into a barrel from 25,000 feet, under tests in the calm, clear blue skies of Arizona, proved far less accurate over the clouded and wintry nighttime Germany. The B-29 was designed to fly high enough to evade enemy fighters, but bombardiers found that those heights, winds below played hob with their otherwise well-aimed bomb loads on their way down to the targets when weather and daylight permitted seeing them. American General LeMay, who often personally led his most dangerous missions, made it policy to firebomb at lower levels. He believed the atomic bomb unnecessary, as his firebombing had already brought Japan close to surrender. At first reluctant to bomb babies, women, children, and the elderly, military powers soon concluded, "This is war, all's fair." Their religious books and national histories were replete with angry gods and slaughtering heroes. The barbarity of those who began the wars was quickly matched by the rapacity of the avengers. Souls with qualms about the ferocity of war were quieted by stories of the enemy's atrocities. Chaplains on both sides blessed the combatants and assured them of the righteousness of their cause. A culture of violence suffused with racial animus threaded their histories: holy crusades, the Inquisition, slavery. Many parts of the scripture advocate violence, and many forbid it. Psalm 137, verse 9, "Happy shall they be who take your little ones and dash them against the rock." The rules of war are worth reading in their entirety, but note items 3, 7, and 9. Prohibit targeting civilians. Doing so is a war crime. Prohibit torture and degrading treatment of prisoners. Limit the weapons and tactics that can be used in war to avoid unnecessary suffering. Prior to the war, the combatant nations would have agreed these rules of war were a common understanding. Still, in a cynical hypocrisy, bombing civilians was already accepted strategy in the 1930s war planning. Ethicists turned to the principle of double effects to bolster support of the new policy. If doing the right thing also generates evil effects, doing that right thing is permissible as long as the evil result is not specifically intended. For example, bombing the Focke-Wulf factory is permissible despite the concurrent inevitable destruction of adjacent homes, schools, hospitals, and so forth. The same is done today to justify collateral damage. It's okay to kill a suspected terrorist with a drone missile as long as one does not intend killing 30 people standing around him at a family funeral. The government decided to test the plutonium bomb, the gadget, over Alamogordo, New Mexico, to verify it would not fizzle. Indeed, it did not, as it yielded 10 more kilotons than the bomb used over Hiroshima. In the days before the test, Los Alamos scientists worried that the fission bomb might actually trigger a fusion reaction of the atmosphere, which would instantaneously destroy everything on the planet as it spread round the globe. They took comfort in quick back-of-the-envelope calculations, which reduced the probability of such a tragedy to 1 in 10. Accordingly, the test went as scheduled. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the head of bomb development, highly regarded for his cultural learning, on seeing the test, was heard to quote the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Little Boy on the left is shown with its cloud over Hiroshima, Fat Man on the right created a similar cloud over Nagasaki 2 days later. Bomb scientists, while isolated from contact with the rest of America, still got to see current movies. Little Boy was an alternate for its first title, Thin Man, of William Powell's Comical Mysteries, and Fat Man referred to Sidney Greenstreet of Dashiell Hammett's The Maltese Falcon. Dropped on Hiroshima August 6, 1945, this gun-type design joined two subcritical masses rapidly enough to initiate and sustain fission before it blew itself apart, yielding 12 kilotons. The Nagasaki bomb used a method of crunching a larger subcritical sphere into a smaller sphere of critical density. These very expensive weapons were used to end the war, to prevent Russians from starting a war, and because the military needed to know their effects for defense planning. Japanese offered to surrender before the bombs were dropped, with the condition of retaining Emperor Hirohito. The Allies pledged to accept only unconditional surrender, both prolonged the war and cost the Japanese nation 250,000 civilian lives. Several British scientists who joined the Manhattan Project passed their information freely to Soviet intelligence out of an ideological sympathy to communism. Thus the resemblance of Fat Man thanks to Klaus Fuchs, Alan Nunn May, and Bruno Pontecorvo. The bomb needed a plane large enough to deliver it. The American B-29s, which were designed originally to reach Germany if England were overcome by the Nazis, were late in production and served only against Japan. Pilots of the B-29s in trouble over Japan were instructed to land in Vladivostok, despite Russian neutrality toward Japan. Of the 4 seeking refuge, 1 crashed, 3 landed with low fuel. Rather than develop his own strategic bomber, Stalin decided to reverse engineer the planes and make a rivet-by-rivet copy. He kept the planes captive and released their crews until just prior to the Japanese surrender. Using spies and trickery, Stalin crafted Soviet atomic parity with the West. What's your irony for Americans? Being hit by your own bombs dropped from your own aircraft. Post-war U.S. military sought atomic weapons which were more reliable, smaller, with greater destructive potential. The first U.S. H-bomb, Ivy Mike, at 10.4 megatons, was detonated on November 1st, 1952, over Eniwetok Atoll in the Marshall Islands. Shown above was Castle Bravo, at 15 megatons, the largest U.S. H-bomb, exploded March 1st, 1954. Marshall Islanders became known as downwinders, were evacuated from the islands, but still cannot return due to radiation. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev ordered the device in July 1961, but required it to be ready before the anniversary of the Russian Revolution. Pilot and crew feared they might not escape the bomb blast. Tsar Bomba unleashed unbelievable energy, now widely agreed to be 57 megatons, more than 1,500 times that of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. Its designer, Andrei D. Sakharov, reduced the potential from 100 to 50 megatons. Were the bombs too big to use? Only if you're thinking gravity bombs. The Russians, expert in rocketry themselves, had grabbed up a few German V-2 scientists after the war. Regarding the graph, The circle inset shows the relative power of a bunker buster, which appears like a period on that page. The Hiroshima bomb and Trinity, for comparison, which appear on the full chart as minor font T's. On October 4th, 1957, Russia placed the Sputnik 1 into orbit. Then a month later put up a satellite 10 times heavier, like it was no big deal. Meanwhile, Americans' Vanguard rockets embarrassingly kept blowing up on the pad. Russia had planned its ICBMs to carry heavier nuclear weapons. America's Vanguard was a grapefruit-sized research beacon compared to the medicine ball Sputnik. But it was frighteningly clear the Soviets could lob their bombs upon American cities. People of the U.S. realized there were many things to worry about with nuclear war. Radiation illness, for example. If the blinding light and cell-crushing blast didn't vaporize you or turn you to soup on the spot, invisible widespread fallout could reprogram your bodily processes. To allay fears of occupying forces in Japan, the U.S. Army censors downplayed radioactivity, even to the point of not clarifying that radiation illness was not communicable. As a result, many Haibukasha bomb survivors suffered and died without care. At first, the government produced numerous civil defense films which emphasized the light and blast effects, but failed to describe radiation dangers or minimize them. They never discussed surviving direct hits at ground zero. All the methods they discussed assumed warnings would allow sufficient time. Accordingly, people looked at the World War II bomb shelters, the underground, altogether lacking in mid-sized American cities, the do-it-yourself Anderson shelter, built in one's backyard, if you had a backyard, or the Morrison shelter, the cage, which hopefully withstood collapsing ceilings and upper floors. What they did not take into account was that there would be no water, no toilets, widespread fires, and many other dangers lasting for days. Those with resources could build shelters varying from a low-tech buried tube versus a deluxe shelter construction, which increases home value. At least the luxe version has the decency of a closed bathroom with toilet out of sight, plus niceties like carpeting, hi-fi, and so forth. Those without resources could hide under the stairs. Federal government officials were to be whisked away to an underground offices and chambers built into the hills of White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, adjacent to the lavish vacation resort, the Greenbrier. Presumably, they could enjoy the facilities until fallout or diseased and injured citizens descended upon the compound. Fears of atomic weapons quickly surfaced in literature and movies. In 1954, the film Them featured giant irradiated ants which came out of a test site in New Mexico. In 1954, Godzilla, a monster lizard, emerged from the seas near Japan, shades of the Lucky Dragon fishing boat irradiated by fallout from Pacific tests. Spider-Man and all the others began in August 1962 at Marvel Comics. Except for the possibility of outgrowing one's underwear, little was understood about radiation. Because of repeated atomic testing in the United States, worries about fallout aggravated underlying fears of an actual nuclear war. And not far behind, building on the war hysteria, came the summer of 1962, with the discovery of Soviet intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Cuba, the potential for a real nuclear exchange hung like a sword of Damocles over the U.S. Nuclear policy then was massive retaliation, that is, a total war response to any warlike event or infringement. We had ballistic missiles of our own based in Turkey, aimed at the Soviets. Neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev wanted war. Each backed down and allowed the other to save face. Study of post-Cold War documents revealed one Soviet submarine had almost attacked the American naval embargo, but for the objection of one Russian officer, who today is remembered for having saved the world. Both U.S. and USSR could not leave the question unexplored. What would happen if we set off a bomb in space? Would it give us a wartime advantage? Would it irradiate the people in islands below? How many could be set off before the neighbors complained? It's vital to our national security. Who's going to stop us? They don't like it. Let them sue. Perhaps frightened by the threat of atomic war over Cuba, and perhaps in response to growing popular protest, the superpowers agreed to ban nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. What was left? Underground tests weren't banned, so underground testing took over. Kennedy and Khrushchev set up a direct Washington-Moscow hotline. Never a red telephone. The caseless teletype machine shown is from the Kennedy Library. The nuclear club expanded. Israel does not admit having or testing nuclear weapons, although it is rumored to have developed such with the Union of South Africa, who has since eliminated its nuclear stockpile. India and Pakistan made weapons in the 70s, North Korea in the 2000s. Iran and Turkey are believed next on the list. As more nations have weapons, the greater the risk of intentional or accidental use. Technologies of World War II became the mainstays for the projected World War III. Ground forces bore the burden of the intra-world wars. Germans were also developing submarine-launched missiles. Those experts came to the U.S., as did their rocket experts. Our ICBMs are enhanced V-2s. Our cruise missiles are refined V-1s. In 1964, Dr. Strangelove, based on facts known at the time and dripping with black humor, brought to the screen the insanities of the Cold War and the tripwires to an accidental but total destruction of the world. The same year, Failsafe, 7 months after Strangelove, a televised theatrical production, explored similar landscape, but in a dramatically serious fashion. 1957, On the Beach, a Royal Navy jargon term for retired, explored how a generation condemned to die from worldwide fallout would deal with their imminent demise. And in 1965, a rock band adapted the phrase, "The living will envy the dead," and called themselves the Grateful Dead. The War Game, not to be confused with the movie The War Games, is a 1966 blend of television drama and documentary depicting an actual nuclear war. It caused dismay within the British Broadcasting Corporation and also within government, and was subsequently withdrawn before the provisional screening date of October 7th, 1965. The 47-minute film was released to theaters, making it eligible for the Best Documentary Academy Award, which it won in 1966. The corporation said the effect of the film has been judged by the BBC to be too horrifying for the medium of broadcasting. It was finally broadcast on British television July 31st, 1985, along with similar films in the week before the 40th anniversary of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. The Cold War practice of flying with nuclear weapons aboard was not incident-free. This map shows numerous broken arrows, the euphemism we used for lost or accidentally dropped nuclear weapons. In some instances, planes split apart and their bombs fell out. In some cases, bombs broke loose in their bomb bays and fell out. Missiles blew up in their silos. Bombers collided with air tankers while refueling, broke up and dropped bombs. Of those bombs fallen, their conventional explosives often went off, although the fissile materials failed to ignite. These events often prove fatal for the crews and recovery personnel. Not all of the bombs have been recovered. Despite the distraction of a hot war, the Cold War persisted and worsened. There were occasionally indications a détente was possible, most notably in cooperation in arms limits, joint ventures in space, and cultural exchanges. And just as the war in Vietnam had moved us off dead center on nuclear war, the Soviets got stuck in a deep muddy of their own in Afghanistan. Little did we rejoice when we got a taste of our own Afghanistan. The Strategic Arms Limitation Talks were conferences and corresponding treaties on arms control in which, despite sleight of hand counting and classifications, the true numbers of warheads stockpiled actually began decreasing. First begun in 1969, a treaty was signed in 1972, placing limits on the number of weapons the Soviet Union and the U.S. agreed to stay within. Smaller warheads atop fewer missiles gave birth to MIRVs, multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles. They were first designed to defeat anti-ballistic missiles. Some were warheads, some were decoys. But bomb theorists soon concluded if all the MIRVs were warheads, clearly some would reach their targets. First proposed in 1983, the Strategic Defense Initiative was Reagan's attempt to save the U.S. and the world from missile attacks. SDI proposed to employ lasers, particle beams, ground and space-based missile systems, high-performance computers for satellites spanning the entire globe to win a battle that would last only minutes. Ted Kennedy lampooned it as Star Wars. In 1987, the American Physical Society concluded the technologies needed were decades away from useful readiness, and it would take at least another decade of research to know if such a system was even possible. Under SDI, Reagan channeled considerable funds into military research. Was this cartoonish effort a stratagem to spin the USSR into bankruptcy, or was it offered as a true defense? Once the APS report was published, funding was cut yearly until it became Brilliant Pebbles, a considerably smaller proposal, a system of orbiting missiles, which was canceled in 1993. Sometimes only art can convey the truth. With perhaps sufficient distance in time, media in the 80s delivered searingly realistic drama about the bombings, both historic and foreseen. This short film portrayed the suffering of the Japanese survivors, their blindness from the light, their skin melting in the heat, and their bodies crushed by buildings demolished overhead. There was no end to the grisly and gruesome in Barefoot Gen, no turning away from horror. The Day After played on ABC TV on November 20th, 1983. It was said more than 100 million people in nearly 39 million households watched the program during its initial broadcast, and it set a record as the highest rated television film in history, a record which stood as recently as a 2009 report. The action focuses on the residents of Lawrence, Kansas, and Kansas City, Missouri, and of several family farms near missile silos after a war between the NATO and Warsaw Pact nations turns into a full-blown nuclear exchange. Although The Day After did not have the sustained images of desolation, gore, people screaming in agony as did Barefoot Gen, nevertheless, it terrified many. Like its British predecessor, The War Game, this realistic portrayal of survivors of a nuclear attack in Britain pulled no punches. Suicides, madness, starvation, population decline to pre-medieval levels, mutant children, infertility, crime, disorder. Threads did not hold back. Those not killed by radiation sickness succumbed to the nuclear winter. It was the most shocking film on the screen until The War Game was finally televised in 1985. These were not the only movies produced in the 2 decades. Others also tried to capture the nuclear-wary audience, but these 4 did so with unnerving severity. With the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the collapse of the Soviet Union soon followed. The dove of peace tentatively perched on the horizon. The possibility of a peace dividend for the world appeared. Had the Cold War really ended? What great projects would we undertake now that we could beat our swords into plowshares?
Well, that was a powerful video, Jim, and have seen it many times. And every time I see it, I see something new, and it always astounds me. We don't have a lot of time left, but I guess, do you have a takeaway, any kind of final message you want to offer to the viewers?
Well, in drafting this and putting it together, I was governed by 3 ideas. One is that nuclear weapons are very real. They may have faded from our memory somewhat. They may be underestimated by the kind of violence that happens every day in video games. But distinctly, if you go to the submarine base, you will see these dragons going out to sea every couple months, and you know that they're loaded with enough power to destroy many cities. So what I wanted to bring to the fore was they're real. The other thing is their power to destroy is beyond our understanding. Films don't do it anymore. Films restrict a person's imagination to the size of their television or their movie screen. We do have a few reports of people who actually were there at an explosion, and it is quite an unnerving process. J. Robert Oppenheimer said at the explosion of the test bomb in America, he said, "I am become death, destroyer of worlds." And certainly bombs have become bigger than that. But the outstanding thing that we need to remember is that however terrible, however frightening these are, we made them and we can unmake them. This is the human adventure. Do we turn at this point in history to do what we know must be done sooner or later? And I think before I go to my earthly grave, I want to make sure that I've done my part to raise this issue to everyone and let them know, big or small, powerful or without power, that they can take a position and end this craziness, not just in this country, but all over the world.
Okay, well, thank you, Jim. Hope our viewers found this informative. And we certainly encourage them to consider enrolling in our class, the Nuclear Weapons Nowadays, What You Can Know and Can Do. We have we're offering it twice. We're offering it May and July. We offer in May on Tuesdays, beginning May 4th. It's a four-week session, 4 sessions, and also on Saturdays, beginning May 1st. In July, beginning on Tuesdays, beginning July 6th, and on Saturdays, beginning July 10th. And to register, you can email Joanne Dufour at jduf234@gmail.com. She is our registrar, and we'll put you on, and you'll be able to join with others to learn more about and learn really what you can do. Because part of the idea is nuclear weapons are scary. We want to give you the information, but also help you figure out what you can do. Just like Jim has put together a very informative video. There are many other things that individuals can do. So again, I urge you to register by emailing Joanne at jduf234@gmail.com. And I want to thank you all the viewers for watching. And also want to thank Jim for putting the video together and sharing it with us today. And thank Thurston Community Media for presenting this program. So until the next program, good night and thank you very much.